Welcome to A Case for Grace. In this podcast, we unpack all the tough questions, the questions that a lot of Christians are thinking, a lot of people who aren't Christian are thinking about God, what it means to believe in God. Is Jesus even real? What on earth is the Bible? Why does God kill people off? Apparently, we covered that in episode 1. If you haven't listened to that, go listen to that. I'm here with my co-host and husband, Jeffrey Slater. And in today's episode, we're going to unpack what on earth is the Old Testament.
It's a really old book.
It's multiple books. It's a canon of books.
Yeah.
The Old Testament, firstly, the Old Testament, let me just clarify what that is. We have a Bible in the Christian faith, and the Bible is made up of 2 books. They call it the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Old Testament is a series of books, and the New Testament is a series of books. And they're historical books. And in fact, I was studying apologetics at university that goes through all of the archaeological and historical evidence for these being historical books. They're records of things that occurred, opposed to just fabricated stories. And I know people will argue with that, but I'll die on the hill for that. I've studied that for a fair while now. So the Old Testament, the New Testament, series of books, it's kind of the Bible or the guideline that we live by as Christians. A lot of Christians think the Old Testament doesn't count anymore and it's really irrelevant, and the New Testament kind of just eradicated it. And the Old Testament God seems pretty punitive. Like he seems like a punitive being, like he punishes us if we do wrong. You know, he punishes you by killing you or setting fire to you or anything. There's so many things that happen in the Old Testament.
Well, that's what it seems like when actually it's not the case.
Okay, great. Let's have a look at that.
Well, when I used to read the Old Testament, it seemed like the character of God was just very punishy and angry and upset, and here are the rules to follow, and it didn't make me want to get to know him. And then later, I found that the Old Testament is, when you look at it through a God of love and liberty and truth and a loving Father, it's a completely different book, even though it's the same book.
100%. For me, it was like, tell me another story, Grandpa. Like, seriously, really? Okay, so let's look at the punitive kind of just definition. I wrote this down earlier, and it says, some see the Old Testament as a collection of rules, laws, and stories of God's wrath. It is often understood that as portraying a punitive God who is more about judgment than grace. And then they believe the New Testament, because Jesus came, it's all about grace. Now, you just mentioned that that's actually an incorrect view. Can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, it's a view that creates a distance from God, when actually the Old Testament is setting up the character of God as a loving God of love and liberty and truth. And in fact, I have this here. It's actually here. It's basically in the Old Testament, everything's built on the love for God and others. Love is the foundation of relationships, health, and peace. When people align with God's ways, truth, love, and freedom, they thrive. When they break away from selfishness or sin, essentially missing the mark, natural consequences follow. So another one, basically, it's when I used to read it from the lens of punitive, of legalistic lens, it was very scary. Yet when I read it for a God who loves us, a God of love and liberty and truth, what began to happen was I got to see that this is the foundation. These are the guideposts of how to live life in alignment with the principles of life itself to have a better life. For example, even the 10 Commandments. Mm-hmm. Yes, they are ways to live, but they're basically recommendations. Live this way, live this way, and your life will be better. It's the end result of a life in Christ.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this semester I actually did Old Testament studies with Talbot School of Theology, and I've got just a couple of notes I want to go over, and then I want to unpack this idea of this exactly. The Old Testament reveals God's law of love and freedom expressed through his covenants with humanity. While it includes laws and judgments, these are designed to protect and guide broken people. God's character of love, mercy, justice shines through in stories like those of Abraham, Moses, David, Esther, Ruth. There's so many of them, right? And what's really interesting, if we look just what it said there, it includes laws. Let's just look at laws. There's a lot of laws, 10 Commandments, a lot of rules. Israelites love to break them, love to complain about it. I can relate to that because I'm just as imperfect as the Israelites. Let's just look at that for a second. In the days of the Old Testament, It was common for kings and pharaohs to actually use the law in a way to express their character to their subjects. It wasn't a law in the judicial sense that we have today. It was a law in the sense of, I am Yahweh. I am a God of love. I am a jealous God. Only love me. So if that was translated into king, I am King Jones, and I am a king that only wants you to be my followers and subjects. I love my subjects. I want you to feel safe. So please,
it's a declaration.
Yeah, it's a declaration of my character. I am this, and Yahweh, the great I am that I am. So it is a declaration of his character, and then through that declaration of his character, we can see the covenants that he makes with, Abraham, Moses. He makes these covenants, these agreements with people, and that is an expression of his love for them. And the rules, let's look at the rules for a minute. And because there are a lot of rules, why do you think, let's just look at a 2-year-old, okay? Would you let your 2-year-old go cook in the kitchen?
There's hot stuff everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really important. I used to look at it as rules authority, which he is the authority, yet I think he was just being a God that was trying to control things, when really, actually, he just cares. And so essentially, it's like, with that 2-year-old, it's like, hey, here are some guidelines. If you touch the stove, you might get burned. If you do this, you might get... So these are guidelines. The 10 Commandments are guidelines on how to basically... it's how to show us how life works when best lived in harmony with God's love and truth.
They're guidelines, and they're expressions of his love through giving us guidelines to keep us safe. For example, the Israelites used to wash their babies in camel pee. Probably not really healthy, let's be honest. I mean, I guess people drink urine these days. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's okay. But back then, washing your newborn baby in camel pee was probably not the smartest move. So he needed to create these guidelines for them to live to keep them safe. And if we look at Timothy Jennings, and we love Timothy Jennings, we talk about him all the time. If we look at his teaching 7 levels to relating with God, he spoke about how God, much like a parent, a loving parent, will relate and communicate to his people based on their level of, or their scope of consciousness, their level of awareness. So the Israelites, being back in the day where they didn't have the internet, they didn't have TV, they couldn't go on to Dr. Google, they needed these guidelines for them to stay safe. The same way as a 2-year-old can't go on to understand really a lot. They can't go and read a medical encyclopedia. So you're not going to let them go and drink cyanide. Like, they're not going to know that themselves. So you have to make sure the environment in which they live is safe. God controlled the environment through guidelines because he loved his people in the Old Testament, not because he was a mean tyrant.
There's 2 people. There's a people that are coming to Christ or curious about Christ. And I want to share this with them, is that the character of God is a God of love and liberty and truth. And if I know for myself, before I came to Christ, I wanted to find the best self-help book I could possibly find, the best book for how to live my life. And so I'd read all kinds of stuff, even spoke on stage with some of these people, right, all over the world. And the best, most advanced book for life, and I change it for, I don't say self-help, I mean book for life, because self-help is very much about self. I'm talking about a book of a life, to have a life built in the way that the Creator created it, is the Old and New Testament. Absolutely the most incredible book for life itself. Secondly, for the Christians out there, other Christians, is the Old Testament is really establishing the foundation of God's character as a loving Father, and it has to be in context. I had to realize it was in context to a group of people who were, bathing their kids in urine, and whereas at that time some guidelines need to be put in place for that level of awareness. And so it looks harsh, but yet it's actually just the guidelines for the that are appropriate to the actual people receiving him at the time.
To the level of understanding of what was health.
Right. They didn't. Yeah.
They didn't know.
So
Much like a 2-year-old doesn't know. It's not a tyrannical thing to do to try and keep the people you love safe. It's just love. You love them. And for me, I used to see the Old Testament God and the New Testament God as completely different gods before I started studying the Old Testament. And now I see, like, for example, in the book of Judges, Gideon, and I really relate to Gideon. For those of you who don't know who Gideon is, he was called by God to go to battle and to fight for God with an army. I'm just going to give a very brief version here. And essentially, he kept asking God to prove himself to him that it was like the right thing to do. Gideon constantly was in doubt. We have doubting Thomas in the New Testament. We have doubting Gideon in the Old Testament. He was always wanting God to give him proof that it was what he was being called to do. And he would get proof. And then he would ask for more proof. He would just still have more doubt. And so for me, like, God just kept giving him proof and giving him proof and lovingly supporting him because he had called him to a bigger purpose, and Gideon was afraid. And I can relate to that so, so much. And so when we look up the stories in the Old Testament, God is actually setting up the coming of Jesus in the New Testament by showing and demonstrating his deep love for the people, and also showing our hopelessness without Jesus coming back.
I think that's really important that the Old Testament is setting not only the framework of the character, it's also paving and making sure a path is established for Christ to come. That's really important. He's paving the way as well because he cares so much, and he wants to make sure that he looks after everyone, as many people as possible.
Yeah, I agree. Even like the book of Ruth, Ruth was not of Israeli descent. Well, she was not Jewish, okay? And God used her to give birth to the line of Jesus. She was the great-grandmother of King David. So even teaching us that God is so loving that he doesn't just love his own children, he is loving for anyone who is seeking him and who wants to be close to him. And that was very unusual because at that time, Yahweh was the God of the Israelites, of the Jewish people. And so people would think, oh, well, that means that he doesn't want anyone else in. He's exclusive to just these people. And yes, they were his chosen people in the Old Testament. But very early on, God set the frame in motion that if he's willing to get the line of his son to come through a non-Israelite, so, Boaz and Ruth, so she could be the great-grandmother of King David, and Jesus came from the line of David. That set the scene for Jesus then welcoming even the Gentiles, welcoming people that were not Jewish. And then Paul himself being the one who went out and spread the gospel to everyone who wasn't Jewish. It set the stage. Like, you can find so many lines from the Old Testament that is really giving us a preview of what's to come.
Can you actually, there's some statistic, there's so many prophecies in the actual Old Testament about the coming Messiah.
There are, and I'm going to get the exact number because what happens when people ask me for numbers is I get nervous and then I say the wrong ones. It happens every time. It's like this weird thing
So look it up. Let's look it up.
Look it up. It happens in any situation, by the way. Even I'm talking about business, I'm going to do the same thing. It's just a weird insecurity. So let me have a look at it. Joel knows it off the top of his head. Joel's really good at it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just give me 1 second. The computer is thinking. It's thinking a lot faster than me. 300 prophecies. Basically, scholars identify over 300 prophecies that find fulfillment in the life, death, and resurrection and the mission of Jesus. And, it's quite incredible.
So is that basically
literally listing them right now?
Is that basically saying that in the Old Testament, there's over 300 prophecies of the coming of Christ?
The first coming, because there's going to be a second coming. Yes.
The first coming,
over 300 prophecies.
Saying this guy, the Messiah is coming, and it's said 300 different ways, prophesizing it. Over what period of years? That's over a couple thousand years, right?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Wow. Yeah, look, Isaiah, 53:3. He was despised and rejected by mankind. And the fulfillment of that happened in John 1:11. Betrayed by a friend, Psalm 41:9. Even my close friend has lifted up his heel against me. Fulfillment John 13:18-21. Sold for 30 pieces of silver was in Zechariah 11:12. They paid me 30 pieces of silver.
Wow.
That's pretty clear, and that was fulfilled obviously when Judas sold him for silver.
You should ask it. What are the statistical chances that this would be done? The reason I like to ask that is because it makes it, when you start looking into statistics of this being written by something that's like by a God, an omnipresent God, there's zero chance this would ever be possible to be written by just one man. There's no way.
There's multiple different analyses by different academics.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a gentleman called Stoner. Stoner. It's a funny last name. I'm obviously a kid from the 80s and 90s. Peter Stoner. If you're from the 80s and 90s, you can giggle like me. It's okay. God has a sense of humor. Stoner and estimated the probability of one person fulfilling these 8 prophecies by chance is one in...
Just eight?
1 in 10 to the 17th.
Power.
So power?
Wait, just you're saying the probability of just even 8 prophecies being fulfilled. Just 8, not 300.
Correct. And then they go on to do the 48th, and just the zeros just get more and more and more and more.
So can you say that again?
There's exceptionally large amounts of zeros here. Stoner, then this is the 48 prophecies, fulfilling 48 prophecies. Stoner extended his calculations to 48 prophecies. And just to be clear, remember we said there were over 300 prophecies?
That's even just the Old Testament.
This is the Old Testament.
Only about Christ coming.
About the first coming, yeah.
Yeah.
Stoner extends his calculation to 48 prophecies, estimating the probability to be 1 in the 10th of 157 squared or something. I'm not good at maths. I'll just be clear.
Ask it to put it in perspective for a kindergartner.
That's a good idea because that's my level of mathematics.
and provide an example. Like that would mean that a needle in a haystack, or what? Let's see what that actually means metaphorically. It's kind of like the amount of U.S. dollars debt is 35 or whatever, probably 38 trillion now. The word trillion is so hard to comprehend for the mind. So let's see what the chances are here.
Do we have any trillionaires? Just a side note while this is thinking.
No, not yet. Or there are ones that we don't know.
Okay, so are you ready for the example that it's done for me, oh simple math person?
Let's hear it.
Oh, my goodness. You have a big jar full of a million jelly beans in different colors. One of those jelly beans is blue with sparkles. And we say, if you can close your eyes and grab the blue sparkly jelly bean on your first try, you win. The chances of picking up the blue sparkly one out of all of those jelly beans is really, really, really tiny amount, almost impossible. So imagine you have a million jelly beans in a jar. You have a blue sparkly one. You have to close your eyes, put your hand into a million jelly beans, and you pick out the blue sparkly one. It's that almost impossible. I mean, that is impossible.
So, but there's somebody out there that's going, oh, but I could do that. Yeah, right.
We should set it up. That should be one of our episodes. Let's get a million jelly beans in here. We should do experiments.
With jelly beans? No, I think Mr. Beast has that covered. So so essentially that is a probability, metaphorically, that one man could even do this. And that's only 48 prophecies. Aren't there in the total Bible? Let's check out how many prophecies are in the entire Bible. First and Old Testament.
We should do an episode on the
validity of the scriptures.
No, the New Testament prophecies. Just a whole different episode on how many.
That's a lot of jelly beans. That's probably 2-3 million jelly beans. If you take all of it, we're probably looking at least 3 million jelly beans.
Okay, it is thinking. I should have asked it to do it for a kindergartner again for my math brain. So there's over 1,800 prophecies in the Bible, both across the Old Testament and the New Testament. These prophecies cover a wide range of topics: messianic prophecies, historical events, end-of-time prophecies, and personal prophecies. About 1,500 have been fulfilled with precision.
So it means we have 300 left.
Yeah. What I find really interesting is if we look at the what is that clock? It's like 90 seconds to midnight, 30 seconds to midnight. The doomsday clock. I think that there's a comparison, and I'm going to be straight out Alex O'Connor.
No, this is an opinion.
Conspiracy theory.
This is an opinion,
This
okay?
is an opinion before anybody puts in the comment section
and
that
it's not biblical.
I'm heretical because somebody once told me this. You're heretical by thinking that. Anyway, I wonder if there's a correlation between the end of times and that clock.
And the doomsday clock.
The doomsday clock. I might do my PhD in that. I think that would definitely get accepted.
Well, let's hear.
They would kick me out.
I want to know how many jelly beans would have. Like,
no,
so you're saying this,
no more jelly beans unless you let me do.
Let's ask for another metaphor on it. There's 1,800 prophecies, and 1,500 are already been fulfilled. And
correct.
And the chances of that are how many jelly beans?
Oh, no, it just gave me 1,800 jelly beans and 1,500 have already been picked out. There's only 300 left. It didn't understand. Sorry, it was me. I'll user error.
Well, look, I'm going to hypothesize. If you take 1,800 and you divide it by 50, I don't really know.
We're now just making everybody
That's almost 3,000. That's 30 times. I think that's 30 times. 30 million jelly beans. It's approximately 30 million jelly beans, and your chances of having that happen to pick the one sparkling one. It is.
If you think
approximately 30 million.
If you think we should do the jelly bean experiment live here on the podcast, please comment yes below. And if I get 50 yeses, I'm going to tell Jeff we have to do it.
Show Elijah the dog.
No, he's asleep.
He's asleep?
He's asleep.
Oh,
okay, team. Anything you want to add with?
Yeah.
End with.
Just how many jelly beans there are. That's incredible. The chance of that. God's back to the Old Testament. God's a loving Father who is miraculous, and he makes the impossible possible.
Beautiful. I love it. Until next time, we look forward to seeing you. Make sure you drop your comments below. Type Jellybean for the Jellybean experiment. And if we get 50, Jeff's going to have to do it.
No, I'm not.
Until next time.